how are we going to reduce almost 20 million tons in just 7 years? That's the question I have, right? Like, I keep looking at the numbers. I'm like, is this correct?
Hello and welcome to Green Shift, where we try to make sense of sustainability. I'm your host, David Austin, and I'm joined by my co-hosts, Dr. Victor Nian, founding co-chairman of the Center for Strategic Energy and Resources, CSER, and by Dr. Andreas Raharso, a pioneer in innovation strategy and next practice, and author of the book Escape from System 1, Unlocking the Science Behind the New Way of Innovation. And today we're thrilled to welcome Melissa Loh to the podcast. Melissa is a research fellow at the National University of Singapore, where she focuses on national and international climate policy, including deep engagement with the UNFCCC process and the Paris Agreement. She also heads the NUS Sustainability Academy, which brings together academic, policy, and industry experts to deliver cutting-edge courses in climate, carbon, and sustainability. Thank you so much for joining us, Melissa.
Thanks for having me.
So, Melissa, we thought you would be the perfect person to discuss Singapore's newly submitted 2035 Nationally Determined Contribution, or NDC, which sets the tone for how the city-state plans to slash emissions on the road to net zero. And to get everyone on the same page, let me read a short summary written by our executive producer, Jordan Cronin. Singapore is committed to reducing its greenhouse gas emissions to between 45 and 50 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent by the year 2035. This is a substantial drop from the expected peak of around 64 million tons in 2028 and puts the country firmly on track towards its legally binding goal of net zero emissions by 2050. The 2035 NDC outlines a mix of domestic emission cuts and international collaboration. We're talking expanded solar energy, electricity imports from low carbon sources, and serious investments in frontier technologies like hydrogen and carbon capture. The government is also strengthening tools like carbon pricing and energy efficiency standards, while leaving the door open to using international carbon credits. So first of all, Melissa, is that accurate? And if so, can you help us drill down on the details?
Thanks, David. Yeah, absolutely. I really like the introduction. I think it introduces Singapore's current NDC very well. But I think what might be helpful, perhaps, is to share a little bit with your listeners as to what exactly is a nationally determined contributions. Quite often, I find when I give talks that are similar to this one, I usually ask around the room one question, which is a really important question. I ask people, how many of you have actually read the Paris Agreement? And quite often, I think maybe a handful, if at all, of hands will shoot up. And it's interesting because it's been 10 years since the Paris Agreement was adopted. And still today, I think there's a lack of awareness around the Paris Agreement and the climate targets, which we, of course, know as nationally determined contributions. But I think the important thing is the name itself, right? And why countries have designed the Paris Agreement in such a way to ensure buy-in and also what that entails, right? So for your listeners, just to share that nationally determined contributions are a core focus of the Paris Agreement. I think without which, I think there's really no point, right? So it's at the heart of the Paris Agreement. It is a form of climate targets, but there's no indication to parties whether or not which they should focus on or what they should focus on. The design was intentional for countries to prepare, communicate, and maintain these targets every 5 years. Right, so there's a window of opportunity that's currently open for all countries that are party to the Paris Agreement to submit a new target. Right, so it started in 2015, then in 2020, 2025 is the current window that's open. So each successive nationally determined contribution actually has to be an improvement on the last one. Right, the actual term in the Paris Agreement is progression, right? It has to represent a progression. But of course, in my view and in my observation, I think that term is used quite loosely sometimes by parties. Depending on their current socio-economic circumstances, they may choose to progress a little bit instead of by a lot, right? And so we can talk a little bit about how we see the current set of NDCs shaping up. In part maybe due to the Article 6 mechanism, which is the carbon markets. Some countries, I suspect, might actually scale back on progression. So in terms of Singapore, I think we were one of the first few countries that had submitted our NDC, and we did so on time. Actually, I think else that most people are not fully aware of is there's actually a timeline in the Paris Agreement as to when countries should be submitting the NDCs.
Mhm.
And specifically, it says that countries should be submitting them 9 to 12 months ahead of the relevant COP, a conference of parties. So, given that this year's COP30 is going to be held in Belém, Brazil, in November, starting I think on the 10th of November or so, then if you work backwards, the deadline would have actually been the 10th of February.
Mhm.
And Singapore submitted its NDC exactly on the 10th of February. I think it was
Mhm.
already prepared ahead of time, of course,
Mhm.
but it was submitted on that date itself, perhaps to make a
Right.
point, right?
Right.
That we got it in.
Yeah. I also remember some comments that showed that, Singapore's always the good student, turns its homework in on time. They don't wanna
I think
get
that is
in.
important. Yeah, I think of course, many other countries have various other circumstances that might prevent them from submitting on time, and that certainly shouldn't be a deterrent, right? Just because
Mhm.
you can't submit on time shouldn't mean you don't submit it. And I think the Paris Agreement mechanism recognizes that, right? And so it doesn't penalize countries for not submitting on time. It merely recommends that they do so in a timely manner so that what the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change Secretariat can do is to collate all of the NDCs and to assess whether or not we're on track.
Yeah, I think, I mean, Melissa, those are very good overview of the NDC Paris Agreement. Um, I think then maybe now it's good to start contextualizing for Singapore, right? Given all the limitations that people talk about, maybe you could share with us what does NDC mean to us, to a small country like Singapore, where we don't have enough resources, enough space to reduce our carbon emissions, and how do you see Singapore being able to meet our NDC goals?
Hmm. Okay, I think maybe what might be helpful in the context of that question is what are NDCs and how are they even set in the first place, right? So prior to Paris, actually countries were already informed that they needed to put together a contribution, right? And it was intentionally labeled as a contribution and not a commitment. Because if you recall what the previous regime looked like, right, the Kyoto Protocol, what it looked like, was very top down in terms of our architecture, where only the industrialized countries were required to have targets and meet those targets. The rest of the developing world were not required to do so. But in today's day and age, that will not work, right? Because a lot of the large emitters actually come from the developing world for good reason, right? Their manufacturing base are usually in developing countries. But the Paris Agreement had to reflect this reality, right? And so in order to get buy-in from all countries, it was then labeled as a contribution rather than a commitment, because the term commitment sounds very scary to a lot of people, right? And it could create some form of political resistance, right? When it's a tit for tat kind of situation in international diplomacy, where well, if they don't do something, I won't do something, which is basically what happened in the Kyoto Protocol, right? The United States decided not to, you know, join the Kyoto Protocol because they had assessed, right, through an economic report saying that the US's economy will suffer if they were required to constrain carbon where China wasn't required to under the Kyoto Protocol. So under the Paris Agreement, all countries were required to submit contributions. And I think the key feature of it is that you decide it yourself. So it's not going to be that hard to achieve it if you come up with your own plans, right? So countries submitted intentions, right? They went back and did their modeling, all sorts of cost benefit analysis. And even before Paris, 85% of global emissions were already covered by these contributions, which is a huge feat, right? So going into the Paris negotiations, many countries, right, most countries had already submitted a number that was comfortable for them. It was politically acceptable for them to submit this contribution. So we got coverage, which is great, right? The only problem was that, do you really think that those numbers are going to be ambitious? If you allow countries to decide on their own numbers, I dare say that it probably wasn't going to be very ambitious because Paris wasn't agreed. We didn't know what the rules of the agreement was going to be. So countries were quite cautious, right? And I'm glad to say that now actually the coverage has increased and countries are actually tightening up their NDCs because they see more value in participating in the Paris Agreement. It unlocks finance, technology, capacity building, and so on and so forth. So it's improving. But the initial set of NDCs that we saw, including Singapore's, would have taken us to 3.7 to 4.5 degrees warming, right? Which is a far short away from 1.5, which is the threshold that the Paris Agreement has set. So where we got coverage, we lost out in terms of ambition. And the second thing we lost out on was comparability, which is a big problem, right? Because you allow countries to submit all sorts of different kinds of contribution. This could be a greenhouse gas outcome, which is the most familiar to all of us, right? So it might be a base year or a business as usual deviation or a fixed level target, which is measured by tons of CO2 equivalent, right? Carbon dioxide equivalent. But there are also countries that submit a whole range of actions and policies like I aim to reduce deforestation by a certain amount, which then will be measured by hectares. And when countries don't submit their NDCs on time, right, as we say, then it's hard to do a synthesis report and say where we actually at and where the gap is in time for a political nudge to take place at the COPs. But when it comes to Singapore, I would say I think over the years we've made improvements to our targets, and I think it's helpful here maybe to share a little bit of where we started in the first place, right? So Singapore actually. Our first ever commitment to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change wasn't even under the Paris Agreement. It was actually under the Copenhagen Accord, right, which was a voluntary target setting by developing countries, right? So in 2009, Singapore actually submitted a deviation from business as usual by 2020 target, right? We had a two-part target, which was one was unconditional of 7 to 11% below 2020 BAU levels. And the second target was which is a related target, which is a conditional target to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 16% below business as usual if there was a global legally binding agreement. So so Victor, you know this, right? What is the important information you need to be informed about whether this target is ambitious or not? What is missing from this?
So the legally binding part, right? I mean, whether this committee.
Major BAU, business as usual level.
Yes.
And so at the time, I was actually an undergrad at the time in 2009, and I didn't know what to ask, what kinds of questions to ask, right? And I was just like, I was curious about this target, and I asked myself, what is the BAU? So where are we deviating from, right? What were the assumptions going into this business as usual level? And it's interesting because Singapore actually made some assumptions that our BAU level in 2020 would have been 77 million tons. Our actual emissions in 2020 was 50 million tons, accounting for COVID, right? So when you set such a business as usual level, right, which is possibly an overestimate, then your reduction from that baseline would be fairly achievable.
They're saying now the actual peak will be 64 million tons, is it? But then what was the original business as usual figure that was used way back in, what was it, 2009? 77. Okay. But you said that wasn't the actual usage. That the actual usage that year was like 50.
Well, that means partly that our so business as usual is usually characterized as a policy absence scenario, right? So you
Okay.
don't any policies to constrain carbon, you would hit 77. But until today, there's no transparency as to how whoever was deciding on that target actually derived 77 million tons. We don't know what the assumptions, what the growth rate, GDP growth rate was. Yeah. Right. But I would say that I think many countries do that, right? Because they want to have flexibility in their target setting, right? They want to ensure economic growth. They want to ensure that they have funds for other means, right? And of course, as I've mentioned earlier, when you constrain carbon, you constrain your economy, right? And so many countries are wary of this, and that there can be political resistance. And so Singapore, being a developing country, was concerned that by constraining its economy by too much or setting a conservative business as usual level, which is what is required today, right? So in 2025, you probably can't get away with such a target anymore, right? All countries probably won't be able to do so. But at the time, it was acceptable because we were considered a developing country, and also our emissions levels are not particularly high. When you zoom out, right, in terms of the big picture, our contributions are relatively small in terms of what we produce. But we're not actually accounting for what we enable, right, by refining energy products, or what we enable in terms of like manufacturing, the use like Scope 3 emissions. We're not accounting for those things. So then in 2015, when Singapore decided to submit an NDC, we changed the metric completely, and we submitted a emissions intensity reduction of 36%. And again, the base year is important, right? 2005 levels was the base year. We also said we would aim to peak and stabilize emissions around 2030. So that, I think, sets the tone for why Singapore has now a downward trajectory, right, in terms of our NDC, because we already said we would aim to peak, right? And so you can't peak and keep on going up. That's the whole point of peaking, and then you have to come down. So at some point, Singapore is always expected to reduce its emissions. I think the crux of the issue here is that how do we plan to do that, right? And so our targets have actually sort of evolved, interestingly, from a deviation from business as usual to an emissions intensity target. And then in 2020, we submitted a peak target at 65 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent around 2030. In 2022, there was this odd situation that we were placed in, where the Glasgow Climate Pact had asked for countries to go and review and strengthen their NDCs. Singapore decided to update its target, where it actually said it would peak earlier and then reduce its fixed level target to 60. Right. So we realized from the latest biannual transparency report that Singapore submitted in November last year that the peak level was announced in that report. And it said that Singapore will actually peak emissions at 64.43, thereabouts, right? These are all projections, right? So if you peak at 64 in 2028, which was the announcement in the report, and earlier when David was reading out the opening statement, right, where Singapore aims now to achieve between 45 to 50 million tons of CO2 equivalent in 2035. So let me paint the picture for you, right? We peak at 64 in 2028. And to achieve our lower bound of 45 million tons in 2035, how are we going to reduce almost 20 million tons in just 7 years? That's the question I have, right? Like, I keep looking at the numbers. I'm like, is this correct, right? Of course, I'm happy that the number looks ambitious, but there's little detail as to how we're going to get there, right? And to what extent are we relying on international cooperation compared to domestic decarbonization? I think these are important questions to ask. But I will say that my impression is that I think Singapore wants the government wants the right to multiple pathways, right? And that's why the details are not announced. And the details are not required under the Paris Agreement, right? You're not required to specify how you're going to get there. And so by not specifying, you can afford to be a little bit flexible with your trajectory and how you're going to make that numbers. But I think for the rest of us who are observing this, it's causing a bit of discomfort, of course, because we don't know what to invest in. We don't know what to focus our time and effort on.
Okay, that is a lot of information to digest. All right, so I think this would be a good place to take a break. Let's take a short break. We'll be right back. Are you a working professional who would like to pursue a postgraduate degree while continuing to earn a salary in your current role? If so, there are 2 exciting opportunities from the University of Glasgow you need to know about. First, the Glasgow Partnership PhD degree offers an opportunity for industry employees to undertake a PhD project co-developed with the University of Glasgow and aligned with the research needs of your employer. Students spend the majority of the PhD with their employer while receiving support from an industrial and academic supervisor. PhD prospects discover innovative solutions to their company's challenges and upskill themselves at the same time. And for Singaporeans or Singapore PRs currently working for a company registered and physically present in Singapore, the Industrial Postgraduate Program, IPP, allows you to earn a salary while pursuing PhD or MSc in the areas of healthcare, sustainability, smart city, and smart manufacturing. Sponsored by the Singapore Economic Development Board, EDB, the program offers a fixed monthly allowance of 4,000 Singapore dollars, 100% support of postgraduate tuition fees, and 50% support of research grant funding for projects. Terms and conditions apply for both programs. For a seamless application process for prospective students or companies that would like to take advantage of these opportunities, please connect with the Center for Strategic Energy and Resources, CSER, to guide you through the next steps and answer any questions you may have. Email secretariat@cser.energy to find out more.
Yeah, I'm a bit curious because you mentioned that you are happy because the goal is a bit ambitious, right? Even though it's lack of detail, perhaps you can tell us, is there any new innovation in Singapore NDC 2035 that perhaps make that ambitious goal happen?
I think everything is innovative because every country has to decide how they're going to meet the NDCs, right? I think the Paris Agreement is also very interesting because it's actually doesn't require an obligation of outcome. So I'll repeat that, right? So the Paris Agreement is not an obligation of outcome or doesn't require you to actually meet your NDCs. It requires you to report on progress in meeting your NDCs, right? And so countries will judge you if they're supposed to judge you. Then they may not be supposed to judge you, right? A country on how they're getting to that target. So there's no right or wrong, I would say, right? And every country is just trying to do its best given the demands of their population, demands of the economy, and so on and so forth. And I think in Singapore's case, the decision was to set this level. Sometimes I in my conversations with friends, I say maybe it was an election year. That's why the number is ambitious, right? In Singapore, because, you never know what goes into these decisions, right? 25 is also an interesting number because when you draw a line from 60 to 0, right? So Singapore also announced a net zero target in 2050. And so when you draw a line, of course, everybody knows, okay, maybe not everybody knows, but most people who are aware of this situation, they are aware net zero is not zero. Net zero can come from different things, right? You can import electricity, you can offset to get to zero. But if you were to simply, right, from a plain language point of view, right, draw a line from 60 to 0, then 45 is actually the accurate trajectory. And so I think that was perhaps one of the reasons why we had included 45 as a number in the 2035, right? So I think that in itself is very innovative, right? Just a number alone, because frankly, I was surprised, right? I was pleasantly surprised that we set up this number for ourselves. But of course, it's worrying because if you were to take that lower bound, then you're talking about 20 million tons in a very, very short amount of time, right? And if you think about what are some of the plans that we kind of sketched in the NDC, so you're talking about electricity imports. How much of it are we talking about, right? I think the number that I've seen floating around is 6 gigawatts, which could be around 30 to 35% of Singapore's energy demand. How does that sit in terms of energy security? How do people feel about ceding that security to someone else? And what happens if friendly neighbors are not friendly anymore, right? I mean, that's a reality we have to grapple with. Offsets, right? If you talk about international offsets, can we get high quality carbon credits in time for 2030? As of today, we're already past the halfway mark in terms of 2025. We have 0 issuances, right, of high quality international carbon credits that we can use towards international offsets under Article 6. So then it leaves you the low carbon technologies, right? So you're talking about hydrogen, ammonia, carbon capture, utilization, and storage. These are all very high energy intense, low carbon technologies. If you think about it, right, somebody has to pay the energy penalty to provide the electrolysis to get hydrogen, right? Somebody has to expense out energy to collect, do direct air capture or other forms of CCSU, and then to transport it somewhere, because we don't have the space in Singapore. You would have to have a bilateral agreement with another country or a B2B, business to business arrangement where you would pump the CO2 somewhere else. So all these are very administratively and financially intensive kind of programs that you would need to expense for Singapore. So it's all innovative. I think to me, we probably got to do a bit of everything, and it will come at a cost to Singapore. And the last thing, maybe just to mention, this is Victor's pet topic, of course. In our Prime Minister's budget speech this year, he had mentioned nuclear energy as a potential for Singapore. And given that level of speech, it was the budget speech, which is really important. I think we should take it seriously, right? That we are considering small, medium-sized nuclear reactors for our future energy demands. Not forgetting that, we have announced that Singapore has banned ICE, so internal combustion engine cars, from 2040 onwards. So the grid will be, additionally, right? So that there'll be higher demand for energy, right? Electricity from the grid, because all cars presumably will be hybrid or fully electric by then. Plus, you have the data centers that are also consuming a huge amount of energy, right, for cooling and so on and so forth. So I think the challenge is then we will have to be innovative. So I think the share of all these different policies that are coming up will probably be what observers like yourselves will be looking out for, because then the relatives of investment and interest in the different policies. But I think all of it will have to be used.
One quick question, Melissa. So what is the most innovative technological initiative that you see in NDC 2035?
I think the carbon capture, utilization, and storage is an interesting and innovative one, because I don't think this technology is very mature in many places. And furthermore, if you think about Singapore's setup, we are talking 50 facilities. How do you collect carbon dioxide from 50 separate facilities? It's an engineering feat, right? You talk about one major coal plant, you can collect, what carbon, right? Like it's relatively easy. It's probably one or few stacks of chimneys. But you're talking about 50 separate facilities in Singapore, not all of which have emissions, direct emissions, right? Some of which are actually consuming electricity. So then you have a smaller subset of that. But let's say 30 or 20, right? It's still hard to collect. So I would say it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in Singapore, how we intend to collect from so many facilities. And where does it go? Where will that CO2 capture go? Who in our neighborhood will be willing and able to absorb and take that carbon and store it underground, presumably?
I mean, of course, CCS is interesting. You brought an interesting point about where do we dump the waste, right? We can capture. There's no place for us to store. A few years ago, we did a study together with our Indonesian partners. We're looking at capturing from Singapore and then sending to a storage site in Indonesia. Maybe a naive question. Do you really think that a cross-border collaboration like that, capturing from Singapore, sending to another country, where of course we pay a fee for storing it, do you think that might even work in the near term?
I think it's going to work in the near term for sure, right? These deals take time, and from what I understand, I don't think anything is finalized or close to finalization. I could be wrong, but my sensing is that international partnerships are still being negotiated. Obviously, the big question is geopolitics. It will be interesting to see whether or not there's nationalistic sentiments, right? Do the general public in countries that are potentially recipients of such captured carbon, even at a cost, even if it's costly to do so and Singapore is paying a fee, the narrative around it could be difficult, right? Like you don't want one day for the people to be upset about such a deal where you're taking waste carbon from somebody else and pumping it into your used aquifer or a geological site, right? So to me, all of those discussions hopefully are being held right now, so that you can mitigate any risk of downstream revocation of deals. But I think we're not having enough of those conversations. I think that's where I'm concerned, right? Because a lot of these announcements they are announced in the NDC, they're announced in the biannual transparency reports, but I don't think the general public or even keen observers like ourselves have very much time to digest these reports and what they actually mean. We're not having meaningful dialogues and conversations about what needs to be done, right? As you mentioned, infrastructure, not just policy or physical infrastructure. It's also about whether people believe in these technologies more generally, right? The sentiment.
Yeah. I think, I do agree. The individuals in the society, the ones that should be the proponents for climate change mitigation. Living in a world, where we have carbon constraints. Scandinavian countries, they actually display a carbon pack for the for the product you buy, the sandwiches and all that. And of course, in Singapore, people that drive knows we're already paying a carbon tax for the cars who drive, even before this whole discussion about climate change mitigation all came about. So those are measures that's already there, and people kind of generally accept it because it is there. Because if people see it every day, they get kind of enculturated about carbon pricing or carbon, or, the price of carbon. Let's put it this way. But I want to stretch that idea a little bit. You mentioned also about carbon credit, and this is also an area where I used to like it a lot, and now I'm getting increasingly skeptical. Not because the carbon credit itself is the devil, but I think really how carbon credit is generated, the MRV process, and also how carbon credit is being applied as a mechanism to offset countries' emissions versus companies' emissions, and that gets interesting. We can go this discussion one by one. So, of course, in a way, the voluntary carbon market pricing, in a way, reflects the confidence of the market. This is crashing. Since the peak of the forest carbon, for example, the people losing confidence. When we talk about high quality carbon credit, what does it really mean by high quality carbon credit?
Right. That will take more than a lot amount of time for sure. But maybe very briefly, just to share. So Singapore has been very, very active in the Article 6 implementation. Article 6 is the Paris Agreement carbon markets, essentially, right? So very, very stripped down explanation. But just to say that we do see the use of international carbon credits as essential towards meeting our NDC, right? We have signed memorandums of understandings with 5 carbon crediting programs, and these are Verra Gold Standard, Global Carbon Council, American Carbon Registry, and ARC-Trees. So these are the 5 that we accept evidence of retirements from, right? So we use the existing infrastructure out there. So we're not reinventing the wheel. But I did want to add that so these programs generally have the same concept in terms of our what constitutes a high integrity carbon credit, right? And so Singapore has several eligibility criteria that you can go online to take a look. But these are those units need to be additional, real, quantified, and verified. They have to be permanent, or at least the developer or entity that wants to retire them has to show how those units have reduced the risk of non-permanence, right? So buffer pools, for instance. Another principle for eligibility to Singapore's system is that those projects that create those units have to incur no net harm. So you can't trade off harm to an adjacent plot, for instance, right? By saving this plot for carbon credits, which does happen in some cases. And related to that is that the project should not cause any leakage, right? So you cordon off a place and actually deforestation happens next door. That's not ideal either. And finally, I mentioned this earlier, the projects should not be double counted. Right. So that's really, really important that to ensure high integrity. But I would say, although buying countries like Singapore can say these things, this is our checklist. You have to fulfill our checklist. But the reality is, think about where the host countries are at in terms of reporting, in terms of MRV, right? Measurement, reporting, and verification. Where are they in terms of project development, capacity, institutional and otherwise? So I think the buying countries have some responsibility to provide capacity building. If they want to develop credits and they want to get the credits from transferring or host countries, right? So Singapore has actually signed a number of MOUs, memorandums of understanding, I think with perhaps more than 19 countries already. But we do have implementation agreements, which are the key agreement with I think 7 now. So we started from Papua New Guinea, Ghana, Bhutan, Peru, Chile, Paraguay, and I think most recently is Rwanda. So we have in force a few implementation agreements, but I think the development is fairly slow because both sets, the sets of countries, Singapore and these host countries, need to develop the right processes. So it's very, very complex. Obviously, it needs a bit more time to dive into. But I think we're trying our best. Singapore is probably one of a handful of active buying countries right now, and just to say we have competition, right? So some of the other active countries will be Switzerland, Japan, Republic of Korea, UAE as well. They're very actively also buying up these mitigation outcomes from other countries, and so our 20 million tons that we might need, right? It's not necessarily the case that the host country might sell it to us. For instance, what I've observed is that maybe because of our status as a developing country, we have not offered like developmental assistance compared to some of these other countries that have been in that space for a lot longer. So a lot of these unspoken rules or unspoken rapport, so to speak, right? This may not be seen by the general public. We may not be able to make up for years of lost opportunity in that sense. So if you're a host country and if you had two buyers and one buyer has been there a lot longer, offering you developmental assistance, climate finance, who are you more likely to sell to? Right. And so these are very real, like these are realities on the ground that maybe for those of us who are observing, we don't have a lot of insight to. So I think it's necessary to study it to figure out how the process can be more transparent and accountable, so that we're comfortable knowing that our NDC has been achieved with high integrity international carbon credits.
Yeah, that was a really good point. I had not thought about it that way, and the fact that, yeah, there'll be competition for these credits, and some of the countries we're competing with have totally different relationships with the host countries. That's something I had not even thought about. If you could leave us with, if it was up to you, what would the next big discussion or forum be about?
Well, I think we should be even having a conversation about the NDC and whether 45 to 50 is achievable,
Hmm.
right? So it's one thing to have a target, but it's another to not know, right? I mean, like I said in the early part of this session, I'm happy, right? I was pleasantly surprised, right, that we have such an ambitious target. But what concerns me is that we're not having those conversations about how we're going to get there. It's all up in the air. Even, I mean, I think most people will be happy with that explanation of, oh, yeah, we want to have multiple pathways. Then just explain the multiple pathways, right? Everybody who has an interest in this, in helping Singapore get to net zero, should have a say. And we should certainly be having more of those discussions and dialogues as we go along. It can be in many different forms, like podcasts, or in-person dialogues. And so we get to know a little bit more about what people think, build those networks. And, we have the same goals in mind anyway.
Thank you so much. Is there anything else that you'd wanted to share with us before you take your leave?
No, I mean, I just want to say it's such an enjoyable conversation. I know it probably raised more questions than answers, but I think we're off to a good start. And of course, I wish you guys all the best with the podcast series.
Thank you, Melissa. Good to have you here.
Thank you, Melissa.
Thank you. Take care. Have a great week.
Thank you.
Thank you.